Hey there, today I'm going to show you how to implement JWT Auth functionality in a Next.js project using Apollo Client. This is going to be JWT Auth using cookies, and I'll show you how to ensure that only authenticated users can view your components and how we can log the user out and redirect them if we receive an unauthorized response from our server. So let's jump right in. Before we get started, I wanted to show you a new app that I've developed called Thrive. Thrive is a productivity app that will include all of your priorities for a given day. It'll allow you to track your habits, goals, and even create notes to replace an app like Evernote. It's completely free and will help you get more done and accomplish your goals. So if you'd like to check it out, you can check it out at thriveapp.one, and I'll be releasing a mobile app as well. So please check it out if you get a chance, and let's jump right into the video. Okay, so we're ready to go ahead and start building out our Next.js application. And of course, all of this code will be available on the GitHub repository, and I'll leave a link in the description to where you can find that. I'm going to go ahead and use Yarn to create a new Next app, and we're going to go ahead and use the TypeScript template here when initializing the application. I'm going to go ahead and call this project Next.js Auth. And it's going to go ahead and install all necessary dependencies. So go ahead and let the install finish up. So after our project is bootstrapped, we can ls and then cd into the Next.js auth directory. And then let's go ahead and open up this in our code editor of choice. So we've opened up our project here, and now let's go back in our terminal. We're going to go ahead and install a few dependencies. So we'll go ahead and run yarn add, and the first dependency will be Apollo Client, and then we're going to need to add GraphQL as well. So after we have all our dependencies installed, we have Apollo Client ready to use. Let's go ahead and run yarn dev to start our development server, and then we should be able to open up localhost 3000 in our browser. So I'm in my browser now at localhost 3000, and we can see the default starter page for Next.js. Let's go ahead back to our code editor, and we can start adding Apollo Client to our application. So the first thing we have to do is actually initialize Apollo Client. So I'm going to create a new folder in the root of our directory called constants, and inside of constants I'll go ahead and create a file called apolloclient.ts. So let's go ahead and create a new const here called client, and we'll set it equal to new Apollo Client. This is of course imported from Apollo/client, which we just installed. We're going to go ahead and provide an options object into the constructor here, and we're going to go ahead and specify the cache should be a new in-memory cache. And this is all we have to do to get a working Apollo Client. Now this won't be much use to us out of the box because we need to add an HTTP link to this so that we can actually communicate over HTTP. So let's go ahead and do that by creating a new const called HTTP link. And we're going to set this equal to new HTTP link. And this comes from Apollo Client as well. We'll give an options object here. And this is where we need to specify the URI for our API, or our backend GraphQL server. Now, for now, let's just leave this empty so that we can finish initializing our client by providing a new property here called link. And now we can specify the HTTP link. So we need to get access to our API URL here. Let's go ahead and create a new constant in our folder called urls.ts, and this is where all of our URLs for our application would live. So let's go ahead and export a const called API URL. Now we know that our API URL for our GraphQL server will be listening on localhost 3001 for our local development. However, we want to actually inject this value as an environment variable so that at runtime it can be swapped out depending on if we're in production or development. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and create a new .m file. So let's go ahead and create a new file in the root of our project called .env. Now to inject environment variables that are publicly available in Next.js, we have to prefix them with next public, and then we can provide the API URL. So in our case, this will be localhost 3001, and then we can access the environment variable at runtime here by calling process.env.next public API URL. And so now we're able to extract the API URL from an environment variable, and we can pass it on to our Apollo client over here. So for our URI, let's provide a template literal string here where we will add the API URL. Now our backend GraphQL server will be listening on /GraphQL. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at our GraphQL backend server. So I've created a sample backend to work with our Next.js Auth implementation. It's a Nest.js project that uses Passport.js to implement authentication flows. And importantly, it actually sets a authentication cookie to implement authentication. Now, of course, I'm going to include this entire project as a GitHub repository in the description, so you can run this backend alongside with our Next.js UI. You can feel free to take a closer look at how we've implemented authentication in this backend, but I have made several videos going over authentication with Nest.js. Additionally, we have a resolver set up for users that will allow us to query the current user and create a user. So if we go ahead and take a look at our base app.module, you can see we are initializing the GraphQL module in our Nest.js application. So in a terminal window where you have the backend, make sure you first install necessary dependencies by running yarn, and then after you've done that, you can run yarn start dev to start up our application. Now, with our backend running, we're ready to continue implementing our Next.js authentication. Now, as I said before, we've implemented authentication in our backend using JWT cookies. Now, to allow this to work with our Next.js authentication project, let's open up our Apollo client again. And in our HTTP link, we want to specify that any requests to our GraphQL server include this authentication cookie. So in order to do that, we need to provide another property here called credentials. And we're going to say credentials to be set to same origin. And what this means is that if we send a request on the same origin or the same URL that our Next.js server is running, then we will include cookies. And this is a security measure implemented in the browser. We can't include cookies to a domain that is cross-origin. Now, in order to make this work in local development so that we can still send traffic to our development server listening at a different URL, which is localhost 3001, we will open our next config.js. And what we can do is implement a function called rewrites. And what rewrites will do is implement a list of URL rewrites for particular URLs. So in our case, we can say that any URLs that come in on /API with any other parameters added to that URL, we want to send it the destination to our actual API, which in our case will be localhost 3001. So in order to do that, let's go and add a new m variable to add our API URL. So our API URL here will be, of course, as we've done already, localhost 3001. And we'll see why we do this in a second. So let's go back to our next config now. For our destination, we will specify that this will be our process.env.api URL, and then we will add the rest of the URL by doing this. So now any URLs on our web server that are sent to /API will automatically be proxied off to our backend server here, but the browser here thinks that it's the same URL, so it will include these authentication cookies, which is what we want. So now back in our .env, instead of having our next public API URL be the actual server URL, we're going to change this to be /API. So back in our Apollo client, we know that this API is going to point to the next public API URL, which will be /API. So we'll have /API/GraphQL, and because of our next config, this is going to get proxied off to the actual backend server here. Now, of course, make sure you actually reload your server. As you can see here, we found a change in Next.js config, so we have to restart the server to take effect. So now our Apollo client is all configured to include our authentication cookies to any requests. Now let's go ahead and export our client from this file. Now let's actually go ahead and use this client. in our pages underscore app.tsx. And now let's go ahead and add the Apollo provider from Apollo client, and we can add the component back in here. So the Apollo provider is where we're going to actually add the client that we have configured in our application. So let's go ahead and add our client, which we import from our contents folder. So now we're actually using our client in our project. So now that we have the client in our application, we can actually make queries and mutations to our GraphQL backend. Now this is just what we're going to need to do to implement authentication. We're going to need a way to query our backend server to determine if we are currently logged in. Now in order to do this, we're going to create a new folder called hooks, and then we'll add a hook called useGetMe.ts. So useGetMe will be an Apollo client query, which will query our backend GraphQL server to get the currently logged in user if it exists. So if we quickly open up our backend server, we can see a corresponding users resolver here, where we get the current user if they have passed our auth guard, which essentially checks to see that a JWT authentication cookie is passed, and if so, we pass back the user associated with that authentication cookie. We're going to go ahead and create a new const here called getMe, and we're going to import GQL from Apollo client. Inside of GQL, we can actually make our query. So we're going to query for me here, and inside of me, we're going to pull out the ID and email of the user that we're querying. So in this case will be our logged in user. And then we can actually create the hook here called useGetMe, and we'll return use query from Apollo client and pass in the query that we just created. Lastly, we'll go ahead and export this query. So now that we have a way to check to see if the user is logged in, let's go ahead and start implementing our auth guard. So the auth guard is what it's going to actually protect our components in our application and ensure that the user is authenticated before accessing that component. Let's go ahead and create another folder called components. Inside of components, we'll go ahead and create our guard.tsx. So firstly, we'll declare an interface for the props that the guard will receive. So the way our guard is going to work is that it's going to be a wrapper component that will receive any children that need to be displayed and authenticated to be displayed. So the children components will be of type jsx.element, and then we will have the excluded routes property, which is an optional array of strings, and we'll see what this does in a second. Essentially, excluded routes will ensure that we don't re-authenticate when we're on a particular route, for example, a login page. So now we can go ahead and declare our guard here. We know the guard is going to receive children and excluded routes. So this will be of type guard props, and we'll go ahead and return just an empty JSX expression for now. And then we'll go ahead and export the guard here. So for now, let's just go ahead and see that our query is working inside of our guard. I will go ahead and declare a new const here, and we'll get some data out of this query, which of course we know is going to be the user. So we'll go ahead and call useGetMe, and now let's console log the user here to see that it is in fact querying our backend server correctly. Now instead of returning an empty JSX expression here, let's go ahead and return the actual children here, our underscore app.tsx, and wrapping the component here, the highest level component possible, we will include our guard now, so that any component that is accessed in our application will be authenticated by our guard. So now that our guard is properly wrapping our higher level component here, we can see back in our application, we still see the default Next.js homepage, but now we should expect to see a console log statement with our current user. And of course, you can see that our user here is undefined. So if we go ahead and look at our network tab, we should expect to see, if we refresh the page one more time, we can see that GraphQL query was executed. But if we look at the errors from the response, we can see where unauthorized because we do not pass an authentication cookie. So now let's go ahead and implement a sign up and login form in our application so that users can create accounts, log in, and get that authentication cookie to authenticate our routes. So we'll start off by creating a sign up page where users can sign up and create a new account. So let's go ahead and open our pages directory, and inside of our pages directory we'll create a new page called signup.tsx, and then we'll go ahead and quickly create a new component here called signup. And to start, we'll just return some empty JSX, and we'll go ahead and make this a default export. So now if we go back to our browser and navigate to /signup, we should see a completely blank page where we have no content being rendered. So let's go ahead and create our form. We're going to go ahead and return here a form tag. And inside of our form, we're firstly going to create a label with an HTML4 of email. And we'll label it email because this will be our email field. And then we can add an input here and say input of type email, actually, to add some email validation. And we'll give it a name of email as well as an ID here of email. We can also go ahead and add the required property here to indicate this is a required property for our form. And then we'll go ahead and just copy and paste this label and input, and we'll do the same thing now for our password field. We will give it a label of password, and we can also give it a type of password in order to hide the text that's inputted here because it is sensitive data. And so now we have our form all rendered. We can go ahead and also give this an submit handler. So when the form is submitted, we want to execute a request to our backend to create this user using GraphQL mutation. So we'll go ahead and pass a handle submit function. And now we'll go ahead and implement the handle submit function. This will be an async function that gets past the event from the form. And using that event, we can actually get the data from the form. So let's go ahead and pull off the email first here. So this will come off the event.target.email.value. And then for the password here, we will pull off the event.target.password.value. And then we'll go ahead and just log out the data for now to make sure we're receiving the data properly. We can go ahead and give this an event of type any for now. And lastly, let's provide some styles for our form real quickly, some basic styling. I'll create a new auth.module.css. And so the CSS will be scoped only for this particular component, in this case our auth component. And I'm just going to copy the main class from our home.module here, paste that in, and we'll give this a name of container. Go ahead and give a gap of 1 rem to all of our items in the container. And then I'm going to go ahead and in our globals.css, make sure that we add an input padding of 0.5 rem and 1 rem, just to give our inputs some padding. So now lastly, in our signup component, we can go ahead and import styles from, and import our styles from the auth.module.css. And then we can apply the styles to the form tag here, give it a class name of styles.container. So now if you go back to our form here, you can see a very basic form where we have our email and password. The only thing we're missing now is the button to submit the form. So make sure we add a button here, a button tag, and we can give it a title of submit, and we'll also give it a type here of submit. So now we should have a submit button, and if we go ahead and actually open up our console, we should see that if we submit this, enter any password, we get our email and password. Now, if you notice that when we typed it in, we actually got the browser refreshing. We want to prevent this, so in order to do that, in our handle submit, we can firstly call event.prevent default. And so now if we go back to our form, we can see that when we log out our password here and our email, we are no longer refreshing the page. So now that we have the user's credentials, we need to actually create an account with them. Now we need to create a hook that will allow us to create a new user. So let's go ahead and implement that. So we'll go ahead and in our hooks folder here, we'll create a new hook called useCreateUser.ts. And inside of this hook, I'm going to go ahead and export a function called useCreateUser create user. And inside of this function, we are going to return a call to use mutation from Apollo client. And so now we need to provide the actual mutation that we want to execute. So let's go ahead and provide that with a new const here called create user will be equal to GQL. We'll output a template literal here. And now we can specify our mutation. We'll call it create user here. Create user that takes create user data. And so if we look at our GraphQL backend, we could also see this information from our GraphQL playground. So we're going to go ahead and look at that in a second. Let's say that we want to create user input, and we're going to call this create user in here, pass in the create user data of type create user data. And so now we want to pull back the ID and email from that user. So make sure that your backend server is running. Then you should be able to go to localhost 3001/GraphQL, and you should be able to actually see our GraphQL schema here. You can see that we have a type mutation of create user that takes our create user data, and that's the create user input of type email and password. So we're just transcribing this into code here. And so now in use mutation, we can actually pass in the create user GQL. And we can also specify types here. So if we want, we could say we want to require an interface here called create user input that takes create user data, which will have the email of type string and password of type string. And we can also specify an interface here for the user that we get back. We know that will be an email, which would be of type string. And we also get the underscore ID, which is of type string. So now in our use mutation call, we can say that we're returning a user and that we require the create user input. And so now this will be a strongly typed mutation call, and we'll get type information about the input arguments and return values. So now we're actually ready to use this hook back in our signup component. Instead of just logging out the data, we can use the newly created mutation. So inside of our signup component, we will call create user here from use create user. And make sure that we've actually exported the function here. So export the const use create user, and now we can import use create user from our signup component. And so now in our handle submit, we can call create user, and now we can provide an options object where we inject variables, and we know this will be strongly typed. It expects create user data, which in this case will be set equal to the data that we created up here. So back in your browser now on localhost 3000/signup, you can enter email, password, and we're looking at our network tab in our dev tools here. When we submit this request, we can see we have a GraphQL request sent with our create user data. So now this user's been successfully created, we can log them in with these credentials and obtain an authentication cookie. So let's go ahead and implement that now. So we're going to go ahead and create one more hook. This time it'll be called useLogin.ts. And in this hook, we are going to actually make the call to our backend server to log the user in with their new credentials. So we will create a function here called useLogin. So this call to our login route will be a post request. If we look at our backend in our auth directory, in our auth controller, we can see we have a post route to our login route where we log the user in, given their credentials. We use the local auth guard, which will use the local strategy to obtain a JWT token. So let's go ahead and create a function here called login. It'll be an asynchronous function, and the body here will say it will be a new interface called login request. And the login request, of course, we will be using the email and the password to log the user in. So now we can specify that the body is of type login request, and inside of login, let's go ahead and create a new variable called res. We're going to call await fetch. So in await fetch, we're now going to use the API URL from our constants directory. We'll call /auth and then /login. We'll provide an options object and specify that this is a post route. We're going to go ahead and specify headers that the content type here should be application/JSON. And that's because we're going to pass a body here. So we're going to go ahead and stringify the body that contains the login request. And so now that we've actually made the request, and so now that we've gone ahead and logged the user in, we want to tell the Apollo client to refetch all of our active queries because the currently logged in user has changed and those queries may be now different because we have a different user querying server. So to do this, we can call client, which we import from constants Apollo client, and then call refetch queries. And in this case, this should include all active queries. So we say all active queries to refetch all the active queries. And then I'm going to return an object here which contains the login function and make sure we are exporting the function useLogin. So now back in the signup component, we can actually abstract that login call by calling useLogin. And now in our handle submit, we can actually await the create user call because it is a promise that's returned. And then we can call login with the data of the newly created user so that we should be logged in as soon as we create the user. So let's go ahead and test this out. So back in the browser, let's test this out. I'll submit a request for GraphQL to immediately, as soon as I send my request, you can see we've created the user and then we've logged the user in with those credentials. So we sent the email and password to the server. And now if you look at our cookies response, you can see we have gotten back the authentication cookie with the JSON web token as our value here. So we have securely acquired that cookie. And then we told Apollo client to refetch all of our active queries. So in this case, we have an active query for me because remember this route is currently underneath our guard. So as soon as we've logged in, the me query is re-executed. And now that we're passing the authentication cookie, we actually get a response back with the authenticated user. And so lastly, let's say that after we sign the user up, we want to navigate them back to the home page. So to do this, we can get access to the router by calling useRouter from Next.js/router. And then we can call router.push and then pass in the route path to go back to the home page. And so now when we submit our create user request, we get redirected back to the home page. So now we can quickly implement a login page that pretty much will implement the same exact logic. We'll go ahead and actually copy over the entire signup component. We'll change the name here to login. So make sure we export default login. And now the only difference is that we don't create the user. We're just simply going to call await login. We're going to go ahead and just call await login and not create the user. So we'll go ahead and delete that, and we can delete the mutation here and the import. So now if we open up our dev tools and go to /login and enter our already created username and password, we can see we only send a request to /login and there's no create user request. So now that we've implemented sign up and login, we need a way to continue building out our guard so that we actually protect routes from unauthenticated users. So let's go back into our guard component in the components directory. Now inside of our guard, let's go ahead and add a use effect here. So in our use effect hook, we want to refetch the user every time that our route changes to see if they're still authenticated. If they're not authenticated, then no user will be returned from this call and we know that they are not authenticated. So let's go ahead and add a refetch option here from our useGetMe call. And then we're also going to get access to the router again by calling useRouter. And now in the use effect hook, we can say we want this to run every time that the router.path name changes or the route we're currently on. So we want to refetch the user every time the route changes, except if we're on an excluded route like the login or sign up page. We don't want to refetch the user on those pages. So we'll say that if the excluded routes does not include the current page we're on, then we can go ahead and call refetch to refetch the user. So we'll also go ahead and rerun this every time refetch or the excluded routes change. So now instead of just displaying the children components every time here, we're going to get rid of this and add a bit of logic where we say if the excluded routes does not include the router.path name as we've done above, then in that case, we will just return the children as the user is authenticated. Otherwise, if it's not an excluded route, we're only going to show the children components if we do have a user from the getMe call here, because that means the user is authenticated. So we'll return an empty expression here where we say if the user exists, then we can go ahead and output the children component. Then we can go ahead and output the children component only if the user exists and we are authenticated. So let's go back to our app component here, and in the guard, I'm going to add the excluded routes prop here, where you can say the excluded routes are /login and /signup, because we don't want to make calls to get our user on these pages. Now back in our application, if we refresh, we can see our call, of course, to get the user. Since we're authenticated and we're passing the HTTP auth cookie to this route, you can see we get the user back and we can actually be on this authenticated page. However, if we open up our dev tools and go to our application tab in our cookies section here, if we want to actually get rid of this cookie and delete it altogether, now if we refresh the page, we no longer have the authentication cookie, so we don't get the user back. It's in fact failed. You can see the call here, we're unauthorized, the user is null, so we don't show the authenticated component. It's just a blank expression here. And now in this case, we want to actually redirect the user back to our sign up or login screen. If this exact case happens, we get an authorized response from our server. So let's go ahead and implement that now. So we want to go back to our Apollo client now, and we're actually going to create a new link here called logout link. And the logout link is going to be equal to a call to onerror. We're going to go ahead and import onerror from @Apollo client /link/error here. Now we're going to abstract a property here called GraphQL errors from this call here. And then we're going to open a function here where we check to see this GraphQL errors. What we want to check to see if this error is an unauthorized error. So from our server, that will be a 401 status code. We'll go ahead and say if the GraphQL errors .length exists, we actually have GraphQL errors and there's more than 0, and we can say the GraphQL errors 0 .extensions .response .status code is equal to a 401. Now we're going to go ahead and have to actually cast this here to type any, because by default it will be of type unknown. So now that we know this is an unauthorized error from our server, we want our application to react and log the user out and navigate us. So to do this, we can use something called reactive variables in GraphQL. GraphQL reactive variables will allow us, our components, to react to something that occurs in this logout link. So let's go ahead and create a new authenticated.ts const here, and we will set it equal to authenticated var is equal to make var from Apollo client. So we can go ahead and pass in a default variable here, which is a default value. So I'll say we are true here. We are authenticated by default, and we'll see why this works out in a second, because we can respond to unauthorized responses from our server. But for now, let's go ahead and export this authenticated var. So now in our Apollo client, we know the user has gotten a 401 code back from the server. We can call authenticated var and pass in the new value. So in this case, it'll be false. We're telling the application the user is no longer authenticated. So now we need to use this logout link in our Apollo client. So to our link section here, we're going to call logout link first, and then we'll call .concat HTTP link. Finally, let's go back to our use login hook here. So after we successfully log the user in, we want to also call authenticated var and pass true, because we are now authenticated in the application. And so now let's go back to our guard component, and we can add another use effect here. So this use effect will now react to the authenticated var in our application. So to get access to that variable here, we're going to create a new const here called authenticated, and this is going to be set equal to use reactive var from Apollo client, where we pass in the authenticated reactive variable. And so now this will be a boolean that will change when we authenticate the user or not. And so now we can pass this into our use effect hook, And when the user authentication status changes, we'll check to see if the user is no longer authenticated. If they're not authenticated, we will call router.push and then send them back to the login screen. And then we're going to call client from our Apollo client constants .reset store, because we want to completely reset the application and cache data to make sure that the data does not get revealed to a potentially unauthenticated user. And then finally, we'll add the router to our user-factook dependencies. And lastly, we want to make sure that this doesn't occur if we're already on a login or sign up page or the excluded routes. So we'll do what we did above and say that the excluded routes cannot include the current router.path name. And so we'll go ahead and also add excluded routes to our dependency array here. And now if I were to refresh the page as well, we can see that we are still authenticated because we still have this cookie. So if we can see here, we still have the authentication cookie. And as soon as we delete it and refresh the page, we can see we are redirected back to our login screen, and we can no longer access the home page because it is a protected route. So I hope this brief introduction into authentication in a Next.js application was useful for you. If you'd like to see future videos such as reviewing the backend architecture for this, please leave a comment in the description, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks and have a great day.